How are you, Marwa?
Hello.
Hi. Let me share my screen. Let's give everyone just a moment to.
Professor,
Yeah.
our final is on the 9th of December.
Speak again, please.
I was saying our final is on 9th December according to the calendar they sent today.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's not too long, is it?
No.
No. You're all super excited, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
So as soon as I look at that, because I saw the email came today. I'll send around a doodle where you guys can fill in your 15-minute slot, during which we'll have the final exam. The final exam will be a conversation between you and I will, in advance, I will have prepared a couple of different topics for each of you, different from what other students are going to be examined on. So I'm going to it'll be mixed up. I'm not going to ask each student the same thing. And I'm not even really I'm going to start with a very broad question. So basically, what I do is, probably 3 topics. I'll write down 3 topics. I start with a Word document, put each person's name, right? Under each one, I decide, I make basically 3 topics or 3 questions, broad questions. And those I'm going to ask you, right? What I'm going to do, for instance, is, I don't know, something about, Bruno. I'll just ask you a fairly broad question about Bruno and just have a conversation about it. If you can't answer that question, I'll slightly change the question, right? I'll try to look for, this is what an examination does. It's supposed to examine you, right? I'll look, if you don't know the answer to my initial question, no reason to panic, because I'm gonna, actually an oral exam is much kinder than a written exam, right? On a written exam, if you don't know the answer, you're just done. You can't get a new question. Here, hand the paper back to your professor and say, no, I'll take a different one. But of course, I want to, in the exam, actually find what you know, if you know something. And if you clearly know something or know a lot, I want to know how much you know. And I'll be able to take it further, right? So I start with that broad question, and if you come out and you have a really great answer, well, that's going to make me ask you something a little more difficult, right? Try to push you, see how far you can go. See how much you know. And if you don't know the first answer, I'm going to back up and I'm going to try to see, well, how much do you know? And then I'll do that for those 2 or 3 topics. And then for each one of those, I will give you a kind of assessment for each of the 3. I've got my own, levels. They're in terms of like poor, fair, good, very good, excellent, right? And I give you a mark for each of those 3 areas. And then when I'm done, I take all your names with the 3 different assessments and I assign grades based on that, right? That's how the final.
And should we study everything from the beginning of the semester?
Yes. No matter when, no matter whether it's online, oral, or written, my final exams are always comprehensive. They're always about compare and contrast and breadth and depth. Yes, you must do it all. Other questions?
Professor?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I got this right. Will the topics be public to us? Like the 3 topics you select beforehand be public to us? Or once we show up to the exam, we just know them? Like you told us.
No, you won't know. You won't know what you're going to be asked about in advance. You will not know. I mean, you will know what you will be asked about in advance. You just don't know specifically. Right?
Okay, thank you.
I have a question about the video.
Yes, sure.
So will we be able to cover log or only hubs? So to see if I can talk about them in the video or not.
Well, you can talk about anything in the reader, whether we cover it or not. But if that's your specific concern, are we going to cover lock? Let's see, how many sessions, does someone want to count for me how many sessions we have? We can do this here. I can do this.
But there are two
We
more
have
sessions.
2 more sessions besides this.
When does we don't have the 3rd?
December 2, we're done.
December 2.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I will probably post a video on lock, but we're probably, we're not going to get to discuss in detail lock. Or yeah. So that's
Okay,
that's
thank
your
you.
answer. Okay. These semesters, they get shorter and shorter, don't they? Would you all have preferred to cover a lot more material? Or you're kind of happy with the pace?
Happy.
Actually, I'm doing sociology, so I am super excited for what we just started to read.
Well, we'll still do some. We'll cover the important things. So as far as, let's get to the, let's say some things about the wrap up kind of Descartes and everything. We talk about there was a quiz. How did you all feel about that?
I was super confident before I start, and then I was like, oh my God.
Yeah, same.
I gave pretty thorough explanations though. Was that helpful? Yeah.
Professor,
Yes.
it took so long to get through the 57-minute video.
Yeah.
It was like there's so many details.
Oh, I always think I speak so slowly. Yeah, there are perhaps a lot of details. I just gave so these questions, you're supposed to learn through these quizzes as well, right? I talked about this a little bit. I talked about this in my other class a little bit, so it's worth talking about here. Like, for some reason, I mean, although we're an educational institution and most educational institutions are educational institutions, we don't talk a lot about how we educate you and what, in particular, grades are about and quizzes and things, right? Like, I expect you guys to learn something while taking a quiz, not to know everything when you start the quiz. I mean, if you do know everything, great, you're extraordinary. But most students will learn things by taking quizzes. That's the point of a quiz. To learn, just figuring out what you don't know and what the right answer to those questions are, that is a learning process because you get to see how well did you really grasp the material. Giving everybody, and this is the same thing with grades. I don't think of, I know how you guys think of grades. You think of grades as like a God-given assessment of what you are and how your future will come, turn out, which is exactly not what grades are. Grades themselves are teaching tools. And that's how I think about grades. When I give a grade, it's a tool. That's nothing more than that. I know it has an impact on your future, so I keep that in mind and I don't give people extremely harsh grades for that purpose, but that is something it shouldn't be that way, right? I should be able to give you grades that really do tell you what your assessment is. And then at the end say, well, relative to all other students who have taken this class, here is where you should go in your future, right? But that should be a different grade, right? Like, how should you have done? Because I'm now assessing what your potential is, right? Based upon what I've seen from you. Those should be two different things, but unfortunately they're not. Because the only one that most students care about is the second one. But the only one that professors care about is the first one. And this leads to probably, you know, there are some of these professors. I've been known to do this, but some in particular that you hear about, who the first quiz, everybody fails, right? Everybody gets a D, or only one person gets an A. And then students just freak out and they write to the dean and they sign petitions and whatever. And it's just a bunch of nonsense, because what the professor was doing, almost always those professors are professors that at the end of the semester give as many or more A's than anyone else. But they think they need to kick you into gear and to give you some anxiety, because anxiety propels people to do better. And so that's what grades can, that's one of the ways grades can be tools, is by giving you a little bit of terror that motivates you to work harder and to say, this is not a joke, I got to really do it, right? And the problem is, if you can't do that to students, if you can't motivate them in that way with grades, it ends up like, you know, T-ball in the United States. Everybody gets a trophy, right? But we're all losers in the end, because the idea of succeeding kind of loses its importance, or its so anyways, or its ability, right? That's why we get to give you lots of grades. Now, that's how you should think of the quizzes as well, right? In a certain sense, the way the quizzes are taken into account in this class is like participation. Because at the end, I'm printing up all of these quiz results. I'm going to look at the totality of your participation in the quizzes. Any one question you get wrong is not going to have an impact. But if you get almost all of the gimme questions, softball questions wrong, such that I can look and say, overall, you weren't reading the text, you were just taking the quizzes, you're not going to do well, right? But anything specifically is not going to be, grades in a course like this cannot be fine-grained like a chemistry class, you know, where you miss 2 out of 10, so you get an 80, right? Like, it's not like that. It just can't be like that. So just something about grades there to keep in mind. That's why I don't focus on them. I don't make a lot out of them. That's not, you know, if I do, I would be very harsh, because I would be using them to motivate you. So it's kind of better just to avoid them and assess you. You know, the average in a course like this is by force around an 80. It just is. That's required by the program. So I can't fail you all. I can't give you all hundreds or A's, right? But the average is quite high anyway. So if you're doing the work, relax. And we'll be fine. Okay, so some things about, because I had some students in that, especially in the last section, who were just, they didn't like that they missed questions on the quiz. Right? It's the better students who were most concerned, because they want to have gotten those gold stars, you know, of approval. So let's just go through how did you find the quiz? Was it a little bit more difficult than average, or?
Like, it wasn't very difficult, but it wasn't easy.
Well
So-
pitched.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found it easier than the previous one.
Yeah, maybe. Let's see. I think let's just go through a couple of the harder questions. First one, that wasn't a difficult one. Let's see. Next one. Pretty much everyone got that one correct. Next one. Okay, the majority of people got this one incorrect. According to Descartes, what is the most perfect? Now, we all know the answer is, because it's green here, the freedom of our will. Why is that? What's the idea there? Go ahead.
But it's a good thing of saying that being created by God makes us perfect. Like everything that is created by God is automatically perfect. So that's why I got confused and put it as B.
Yeah. So first of all, we can't be most, so I point to this, now Descartes, I think he mentions this at least 3 times in the reading, and I mentioned it once in class, this idea about freedom of the will. I asked this because it plays a very kind of interesting function or in his argument, this idea of the freedom of the will. Now Abdul says that, you know, we're created by God. Isn't that what makes us, what's most perfect about us? But we are finite things, you know. We lack many perfections. So just our creation by itself. So an example of that is my intellect, right? My intellect is perfect only in one respect. Namely, that if I clearly and distinctly represent things, then those representations are, well, they're accurate. They're not true even, right? Because truth, it doesn't belong in the intellect that way. But at least they're just, they don't lead me astray. They can't lead me astray. That's it though, but I don't represent everything clearly and distinctly, and I don't represent everything, right? My intellect is very limited, right? But Descartes says that's not a big issue. Now, what kind of issue am I talking about? There was in the period this discussion that could be broadly brought under this term, theodicy. Theo means God, right? And dike is from, they're both from Greek, right? Dike means justice. A theodicy, so terminologically, is a justification of God. I say, well, what does that mean? Well, it's anything falls under the notion of a theodicy that tries to answer a question or presents a theory in answer to anything like the tradition, a kind of traditional argument or what's called the problem of evil, right? So this is not the one Descartes concerned with, but a lot of people just naturally, it occurs to them, God is perfect, God is all powerful, God is all knowing, but there are bad people in the world. People get hit by cars and die who are good people. The world is full of stuff that seems inconsistent with the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good being, right? Just seems, there are wars, there's earthquakes, there's disasters, there's diseases. How could God have, this is just something that naturally occurs to everybody. And so obviously you need an answer to that if you believe in God, especially if you're a philosopher. And we saw in Alexander Pope that there was a lot about a theodicy, right? And his explanation was, or part of it, was, well, you don't understand what perfection really is. You think perfection is all focused on you, what you want. But perfection is actually something that can only be fully comprehended from the perspective of the divine being, from a perspective that is infinitely greater and more complex than any human mind could even grasp it. And so the answer there is when your friend is hit by a car and dies, and you are outraged at God, that's an example of your arrogance. You think you know what is right and good, but you don't, right? We are not the center of things. So that's a theodicy. Now, Descartes' not concerned with that kind of theodicy, but he's concerned with another one, an intellectual, theoretical one, which is the problem of not of evil, but a problem of error. God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and God is all-truthful. How is it that human beings ever err, right? How can we err and it not be God's fault? And this is where freedom comes in. So he undertakes this analysis. He says, okay, well, if we're gonna solve this problem, we need to understand what error really is. And then maybe we can find the solution. Well, error is not, so what is an error? An error is when we state something that is false, right? What does it mean to state something? Well, to state something is more than to just have an idea of it. If I have the idea of a triangle, Can that be false or true? What do you think?
No, because it's just an idea.
Just an idea.
No, because we didn't affirm it or assert it.
We're not saying anything about it, right? So truth, in other words, truth only has its proper place in what are called judgments, when one or more two or more concepts are connected together. So I say the triangle has four sides. I have the concept of triangle, which by itself cannot be false or true. And I have the concept of four sides that by itself cannot be false or true. And I connect them together in a judgment that for the first time can be false or true, right? And it's false. Now, so judging is where falsity comes from. And judging is not an act of the intellect, it's an act of the will. It's a choice. It's something we do, right? So that's why freedom's important to him. Freedom is what makes and governs or is involved in our judgment. And we are free in judging in that when we do not clearly and distinctly represent something, we have complete freedom to judge that it's either true or false. We can do either. Nothing determines us one way or the other. Now, if we do clearly and distinctly represent a triangle and four sides, then it will become impossible to judge incorrectly, right? And so our freedom disappears in that case. Our judgment has to be true. That's only true of clear and distinct ideas, and that's kind of the idea behind the whole method, is that if you stick to clear and distinct ideas, you cannot fall into error. So the intellect never leads us into error for Descartes, even though it's limited and finite. We don't clearly and distinctly represent things, and we don't represent all things. And that makes it possible to fall into error, because that makes it possible for us to judge things about which we are not clear and distinctly aware, but it doesn't make it possible in that it creates it, because freedom is what does that, right? So if there's error comes from freedom. Now you get it, because now the question is, was God wrong to give us freedom? And Descartes' answer is, freedom is the most divine thing in the human being. So God would have been worse to take away our freedom, even though we would have then therefore only known truth. So with freedom comes the possibility of error, which is our fault. It's our fault because it's the misuse of our freedom. But if God didn't make it possible for error, then he would have had to take away freedom, which is the thing most divine in us. Now, why is it the most divine? That's the final question, as it were. Why is freedom the most divine? Because it's most perfect. And perfection in Latin philosophy, in most European languages even, the word perfection is built from the word completeness. So to be perfect is to be complete. We tend to, in English, you don't get that so much, right? But like in German, Vollkommenheit, vollkommen, to come fully together, right? To be full. All of these have these notions of fullness and completeness in them. And so what's the idea that freedom is perfect? It's complete. It's not partial freedom. We have complete freedom to judge something to be true or false. Nothing limits that freedom one way or the other. And so it's complete, and that means it's perfect, and so it's most divine. And another way of, that's probably by itself not very convincing, but there's a kind of another idea under there that you might recognize, which is freedom. Imagine if God didn't make us free, right? Would we be less than we are? Like, how important is freedom? Let me give an example. Like, if we were not free, then we would just be kind of, everything we would do would be necessary, right? So we'd be like machines. And then what value would there be in our existence?
Yeah, I guess we would have no purpose whatsoever. It would just be like useless, like يعني nothing that we produce will be of our own work. Nothing can be attributed to us. It's all, yeah, God made us that way. God let us figure it out that way. Nothing, يعني, we would have
If we had any purpose, it wouldn't
selves.
be our purpose. It would be something we were being used for, right? And like any other instrument, we
Yeah.
would be replaceable.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Even a philosopher named Crucius in the modern period, he argued that God necessarily had to create free beings because that was the only way in which God could be truly glorified. Because if God created machines to glorify him and to worship him, that would be stupid, right? It wouldn't add anything that God couldn't give himself. But if you're free, if human beings are free to reject things, then when they choose not to reject, when they choose to glorify and praise God, it for the first time has significance and meaning, right? It's like Abdul creates a computer program that every morning says Abdul is a great guy. It's just pointless. It's stupid, right? But if he could create a computer program that was free to decide whether Abdul was a great guy, then he would listen to it, right? And say, oh, well, today it said I'm a great guy. Yesterday it said I wasn't. I must be a great guy. It matters now suddenly. So this is the idea behind the kind of the deeper idea, where even though on the surface, when Descartes makes it this kind of formal argument about freedom being perfection, you're just like, well, whatever, these are just philosophical words. But there's this kind of deeper intuition we have that having autonomy, having freedom means we matter, and therefore what we do matters. And if nothing mattered, it can't be that great or important. So without that, it kind of banish all importance. So this is what kind of a lot of stuff behind this one question with this issue of freedom in Descartes. Also, as we saw before, freedom is the key to the method of doubt. The method of doubt is the exercise of our freedom and trying to reject things. Right? That's a very nice, something often missed both in the literature and in teaching Descartes, I think. Okay, this one pretty much everybody got. Something on this one, although most of you got this. Descartes' cosmos, like those of Alexander Pope and Francis Bacon, is one in which, let me look at the computer is not lying. Just want to make sure I check my chat here. Okay. Like those of Alexander Pope and Francis Bacon, is one in which we should not be concerned with the ends or purposes of things, so-called final causes, at least not insofar as these are concerned with the physical world. What is Descartes' reason for holding this view? What's nice about this is it's one of these interesting cases where, so Descartes' goal, as we've seen, is in a way to defend and justify the method of mathematical early modern physics, right? And for the most part, that seems like something that he has to find his own new resources for, right? He has to find a new way to do that. But here, he's exploiting a religious argument that he believes the church will like, right? And it's exactly these kinds of moments in Descartes where people say, Descartes' not being honest. He doesn't really think it for that reason. He thinks it for his other reasons, but he puts it in that form because he thinks it'll be persuasive. So what does he do? Of course, we knew that part of the church's view was that early modern science was too vain, put too much confidence in human reason. Notice that's something that Pope says early modern science doesn't do, right? He actually agrees. Human beings are arrogant. It's our belief in that we have so much knowledge that is our greatest problem. But science teaches us that we lack all this knowledge. So there's some agreement there between the church and Pope and others about human arrogance and intellect, but for completely different reasons. One is saying science is arrogance, and the other is saying science is what removes our arrogance. And in fact, the church is arrogant. right? They think they know all these things that because they've been revealed to them and to them alone. So they're the arrogant ones. Now Descartes can kind of tap into that and say, on this fact, Aristotelian philosophy was all about, and physics was all about purposes, final ends, goals, right? You may remember this, some of you. Like rocks, why do rocks fall? Because rocks have a target they aim at, meaning the center of the universe. It is natural, everything they do in pursuing that goal is natural. Fire has a natural goal, which is the heavens. Planets, because they're made out of the fifth element, have a natural goal, which is to continue in their circular motions eternally. So Aristotelian physics was all in terms of goals, final ends, final causes. And in the medieval period, that of course, well, in Aristotle, those goals were not God's goals because God didn't create the world. Those were the goals of the things, right? And they had no real relationship to divine purposes because the world was eternal. So they weren't created for any purpose beyond their own internal purpose to govern their actions. But of course, when the Christian church came along and absorbed Aristotle, you had this idea that God created the world, so his purposes and the Aristotelian physics must be integrated together. And somehow we must understand physical purposes as also divine purposes. And then you get these kind of odd theories that like God created cows in order for us to eat them and made the cows made of matter for the purpose of that. And underlying that is the purpose of how matter operates. And all of this should fit together somehow into the ultimate scheme of divine purposes. Now, physics, modern mathematical physics, it rejects the Aristotelian philosophy, and in particular, its use of final causes in physics, at least in its normal way. So matter no longer follows a purpose, right? It follows laws, general universal laws. So what Descartes is doing here is he's saying, look, he's using the church's own argument and says, look, to believe that we human beings could conceive of God's purposes is arrogance and vanity. So we as physicists should no longer use purposes, which is funny because it was the church who used purposes in physics, right? So it's using the church's own general view against its own physics, right? Using it to motivate his mathematical physics. Bacon had the same idea. Many modern philosophers, because they understood modern science, doesn't employ purposes any longer, have the same kind of idea. There are purposes. There are even purposes in nature, but we can't know them. And so we should leave them out of our physics. Now, as I said, a lot of people take Descartes when he says things like this and say, that's not really his view. Really, Descartes is, well, maybe he's just an atheist. He doesn't believe in divine purposes at all. But he acts like he does, right? Just to not be, if he were to say there are no purposes at all, then he would get in a lot of trouble, right? He has to say, well, there are such purposes, but they're not to be studied in physics because that would be arrogance and vanity. But no, probably not. Descartes almost certainly believed there were purposes. It's just too much to ask. It wasn't so easy to just be an atheist in our sense in those days. There probably, according to our point of view, there almost were no atheists then because they just couldn't be. Oddly, though, a lot of people would be called atheists. We'll see that in Hobbes. You'll see what was called an atheist in the modern period is not what we would call an atheist today. But we'll see that. I'll explain that a little bit better when we get to Hobbes.
Sorry, Professor, can I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely.
In my notes, I wrote once that when we were making a comparison between Descartes and Bacon, I wrote that, and then my question is to correct my note. I wrote that Bacon is extremely concerned or interested in the ends of the using of scientific method, because he wants to see the implications to how we as humans use nature,
Yes.
while Descartes did not care about the implications but about the method itself.
Yeah.
Is this correct?
Yes, this is correct.
Okay,
But
so what makes in the previous question, what makes an incorrect answer? Because on that note, based on that note, I answered the question.
yeah, so the reason I put this is final causes, right? That's why I put this here. You just misunderstood the question. I see now, I hadn't anticipated this possibility of misunderstanding it. But you see the difference between, so Bacon is very interested in what we can do with science. What we can do with science. Not with what the purposes of things are in nature. Why God created them. That's not part of his physics. So it's the difference between, so Bacon is very much interested in our use of things, but not at all interested, or at least he says physics is not interested. He's very explicit about this. Final causes, which are this idea of causes in nature, purposes in nature, that exist there with or without us. These don't have any place in physics. All right, so you could say, well, one person as a physicist would say, well, the real explanation as to why Jupiter is there is because it's God put it there. Okay, it's a bad example because I can't think of why God would have put it there. So that we could look at it to remind us of his majesty and so on and so forth. And these are real explanations as to why physically the planet of Jupiter is there, right? That's a final cause. Now, it's completely different if I say, like, what could I do with my knowledge of Jupiter? Right? This is a question about the former, not the latter. And you are completely right. When it comes to the latter, with what we can do with things, Bacon that's what he's all about, and Descartes is not. And Descartes wants to do stuff with it, but it's not by any means his primary concern. But for both of them stand in this camp of banishing final causes from physics, but not from metaphysics, and not from religion, but from physics itself. Okay, great question, Marwa. That clarifies a lot of things. Why does Descartes choose doubt? I think you all pretty much got this. But this question is important because one of the typical things students walk away when they read Descartes, particularly when it's taught in high school and things, is that he's a skeptic, right? That somehow he wants to doubt things because he likes to doubt things, which is the exact opposite of the truth, right? Descartes, it's also a psychological fact about people. Like if you are someone who's obsessed with your personal safety and you're out in Beirut in the middle of the night in the dark, you're going to suspect everything you see is someone coming to get you, right? A person on the street corner is hiding a gun. You're going to be suspicious of everything because you are concerned with safety, not because you want to be suspicious. That's what Descartes is like. He's suspicious of everything being false because he's so obsessed with finding the truth. And if he could just have truth and nothing else, forget doubt. What's the point of doubt, right? The point of doubt is only to get truth. If you could do without it, he would have. So it's not something it's like he thought we should doubt, right? What doubt really does for us is shave off and allow us to reject all those things that are uncertain, which is a lot of stuff, right? Which is like all of previous philosophy, all of tradition, everything we don't examine with our own minds, everything that's not amenable to modern mathematical physics, all that gets gone into the wastebasket, right? And that's what doubt does for Descartes. It allows him to get rid of those things. Hobbes says the quarrel, so now we're getting to Hobbes a little bit. So you're starting to introduce this. Hobbes says that quarrel or war between people arises from three causes. Competition, glory are the first two, and what is the third? What was the answer?
A.
Fear of others. He also sometimes calls it deference, which might be a bit confusing to you, but mark that in your text. So Hobbes, as we're going to see, he lived through the English Civil War, right? The English Civil War went from 1642 to 1651. The Leviathan, Hobbes' book on political theory, was published in 1651, the year the Civil War ended. So not surprisingly, the Civil War had a very, very large impact both on Hobbes' political theory and on his view of human beings, right? Because in Civil War, you see people more or less under the worst possible circumstances, right? You as students, at least from your parents, have probably heard enough about this. The Civil War is not good. So it's so bad, actually. One of the worst things about it is, well, there is no safety. No matter who you are, you cannot guarantee your own safety. Everyone is killing everyone else. Everyone is betraying everyone else. You can't trust anyone as an ally. You can't walk in the street. You can't, it's not that you will die. The worst part is that life is so precarious and uncertain. That's the trouble with Civil War. So Hobbes, this is what he thinks. Civil War is like the worst thing there is. Having a dictator who systematically tortures children is better than Civil War, right? Like anything, any form of government is better than Civil War because it at least is regular, right? It at least sticks to, torturing children and doesn't just, it's not just complete chaos. It does one thing badly, and that's better than doing everything badly. Now, I don't know if this is exactly true, but this was quite his conviction. And this is why he ends up with a form of government that is often called absolutist, absolute monarchy, because there is never justification to overthrow the king and to therefore bring about civil war. There's never justification for revolt. Nothing the king could do would justify the people in revolt. There's a little bit of complication here, though, we'll see, because you can revolt still, and Hobbes thinks that you will revolt in certain circumstances, not as a people, but as an individual. So let me just give an example. This is kind of how Hobbes thinks. We are all driven fundamentally. This is one of his, you can see this coming out of Civil War as well. He sees people are not good. He has a very, very negative conception of human nature from our point of view. From his point of view, he would say it's not negative, it's just real. It's just realistic, right? It's not negative. We can't be negative because we couldn't be any better, so there's no point in that. What we are truly driven by are these three forces: competition, glory, and fear of others. And of all of them, the third is the most powerful. And what does he mean, fear of others or deference? He means we act because we fear that if we don't act, others will exploit us. So for Hobbes, like the most human act would be for you to, sit in your house. You're afraid your neighbor's going to rob you if you have money. You should be afraid because he wants it, because that's human nature for Hobbes. And so you should expect him to try to rob you. So you should buy a gun. And usually what you will do, if you're intelligent, is you won't wait. You'll think about it, right? And you'll think, well, okay, I have a gun and I have money, but I don't have a good alarm system. What if I'm asleep when he comes into my house? What if he knows how to pick locks? This is bad. Gun doesn't solve my problem. I need to break into his house and kill him before he attacks me. Yes, this is This for Hobbes is the way, is like, in essence, what human nature is like. And and it should be that way. That is how human beings in a civil war should act. Because that's the intelligent thing to do. And the intelligent thing to do is always the thing you will do if you are intelligent. So you kind of got this, we are for Hobbes like preservation machine, self-preservation machines. Our fundamental drive that we cannot avoid and cannot contradict is that of preserving ourselves. And we do everything to preserve ourselves. Even when we commit suicide, it's to preserve ourselves. But when we commit suicide, so we have to be confused, right? Basically, we don't understand what we're doing. We think we're being damaged in this world, and so we'll survive in another world, right, by killing ourselves. That's a mistake, because Hobbes is a materialist, so you are destroying yourself. But at least he thinks you're still trying to preserve yourself in some way, even when you commit suicide. Everything you do is to preserve yourself. And if you're intelligent and you have the best means, you can figure out the best means to preserve yourself, then you will and therefore ought to pursue those means. And if there's civil war, the means to best preserving yourself is to kill everybody else, because you can trust none of them. So if you were, for Hobbes, if any of us was super powerful, such that we could kill every other human being, or at least subjugate them and make them our slaves, we should do that, and we have the right to do that. And we will do that. All those things are the same for him. What you will do, what you should do, and what you have the right to do. But that's not the way it is. We're not so powerful. And so that's not the most intelligent thing to do. It won't work. Yes, go ahead, Marwa.
My question is, why do these people get famous? I mean, I can understand why Machiavelli in his radical ideas, because he's supporting the governors in general. But why someone like Hobbes, with these like extremely radical ideas, got famous at that time, and still up to now?
Like, it depends who they're radical for. Like, you might see them like that, but maybe at the time, I don't know.
Exactly. This is why I gave the example of Machiavelli. He was violent, but because he was, let's say, with the governors, so this is why he got famous. But someone like Hobbes, it's about society and neighbors, and it's literally about community. So, and he's with violence, and he's saying that it's the nature of us. So what
But
are
what's
the
ironic is that he's like encouraging violence, but he doesn't want war.
this is what I don't understand.
No, so you have to understand him like Descartes. That's why I gave that example. Descartes was obsessed with truth. So he talks about doubt and how uncertain human knowledge is. Hobbes, the most important thing for him is peace. His entire political theory, government's sole driving purpose is peace. Why? Because human nature is so bad. Not bad from his point of view, though, right? Because good and bad, he doesn't use good and bad that way. It's not a judgment on how good or bad it is. It's supposed to be realistic. This is what human nature is. Human nature by ourselves without government equals war. Government is the only way to avoid that. That's why government is so important. That's why even the worst government is better than no government.
Okay, I have another question, if I may.
Yes.
The government is so important for him to keep peace and so on. So
Yeah.
why is he encouraging neighbors to kill each other if they suspect or?
Well, you can take it this way. First of all, he would just say, well, I mean, like Descartes, he would say, well, this follows from my theory, as you'll see, right? He'll give you some scientific, theoretical, philosophical justification. But another way to see that is it's a war. It's kind of a lesson to the reader, right? Look, if you don't put all your effort into forming a good government, this is the alternative, right? He's not saying you should kill your neighbor. He's saying if there's no government, then I'm not even prepared to say that it's wrong to kill your neighbor. Right? I'm saying that's the way it should be if there's no government. So you better get a government. You better maintain a government. Because if not, then there's nothing to worry about when you kill your neighbors, right? There are no laws. There's nothing. You have no recourse. If you revolt against your government and your neighbor kills you while you're sleeping, good for them. Right?
You deserve it. Yeah, thank you. It's a good
Yeah. And of course he would say, it's not that you deserve it, but you should expect it. If you're smart, it's all about intelligence here in the respect that government is a means to an end. So we're all driven by self-preservation. Without a government, that self-preservation is best maintained through the destruction of others. But in the presence, but the destruction of others is not the best way, and without a government is not the best way to preserve ourselves if you're intelligent. You'll realize the best way to preserve yourself is to give up your right to destroy others in order for them to give up their right to destroy you, and to make an agreement not to destroy each other. Or a better, which is that if one of us tries to destroy the other, the state will destroy the one who does that. And so what we do is we get together and say, I can't trust you, you can't trust me. So this is not a good situation, because it would be if I were strong enough to kill you, I would be done with it. That would be it. But I can't, because any three of you could get together and overpower me. So my life without a government is precarious no matter how powerful I am. I'm always going to be worried and have anxiety, and I'm always going to be open to attack. And so the intelligent thing to do is to get together and say, let's create a third power, more powerful than both of us, that has the right to decide with judges, that has the right to punish, that has the right to keep the peace. And we both agree not to kill each other so that we can get along and prosper individually. So we can pursue our own self-interest. And as it turns out, this is one of those gambles we make where it seems like by giving up part of our own interest, we gain overall. Right? You can't collect a lot of money.
Professor?
If you want to collect money, just stealing money from everyone else and robbing all the banks is not the way to do it. The way to do it is to have very strong banks, create a business, and then you can have more money than you could ever have without banks, right? So that kind of creating a common system allows the individual to have much greater potential for self-preservation and profit than without that. Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, if he believes this is human nature, isn't he indirectly saying that humans are bad? I don't get how this doesn't stem from the fact that we're bad.
Because so Hobbes, remember this thing in Bacon called the idol of the marketplace. This idea that words are not well formed to express truth. This is an idea that's found in a lot of modern thinkers, and it's very clearly present in Hobbes. So what Hobbes does, I know this is a roundabout explanation, but I'm getting there. What Hobbes does is, like other people, so the general idea is, well, what do you do then if language is corrupt? Well, you have to do some kind of investigation of what's really there in the world, right? What's really true. And that might mean deciding that there are certain things that just aren't in the world that a lot of people have names for, right? Like
So he doesn't believe that good and bad exist.
he doesn't believe good and bad exist in the sense that most people use the terms good and bad. He doesn't think there are such things. So what does he do? He says, well, good and bad, they might still be useful words if we just attach the right meanings to them. Now, good and bad is objective facts in the world Hobbes doesn't believe in. But he says, but maybe good is a good word for things we want. So maybe good is what is desired. Maybe bad is what we don't desire. From here on out, I will use good and bad only to mean those things. And then you go, okay, if you don't read that passage, then you get to another passage where he says, killing another person in a state of nature is good. You're like, what? What are you talking about? It's what you want. It's good. Because that's how I use the word now. Because the way you were using it is nonsense. I've redefined the word for you, right? Or right. He has a very unusual notion of right. I have the right to your body in a state of nature. I have the right to take your life. Now, by that, he doesn't mean that I ought to do it or anything like that. He just means what is right is what I can do. Period. That's what right means. So he's redefining lots of words. And so he about what a human being does, what a human being does, they always want to do. So it can never be bad. Right? It can be bad to other people if you don't want that.
It's like Riyad Salama is.
It's like
I don't
what?
know what's in her head. Riyad Salama, the banks and I don't know who's in the banks and Lebanon. They want to steal our money, and this is right. They are convinced that this is right. This is completely okay.
Yeah. I mean, Hobbes should be very interesting to you guys, because I mean, there's a similar thing, right? The problem with the politicians is that they are not convinced that a well-running social system is to their benefit, right? It's not to their benefit, because their benefit at the moment, they can only, steal money from the public by there not being a good system in place, right? Like if they have no interest in improving the system, because improving the system would make them as individuals less powerful and wealthy. So they kind of feel like they're these Hobbesian supermen who, because they would say, well, anyone in my place would do what I'm doing. There's nothing wrong with it. If I can do it, it's right. It's fine until you guys stop me. And then I will stop because you've stopped me. But until then, I'm just going to do what humans do, which is take advantage of, I mean, you have to say to the Lebanese politicians, they're acting as very good Hobbesian individuals, right? And of course, they always would be, even if they stopped, because they would eventually stop because they would recognize it's no longer in their interest, that path is no longer possible, and that by continuing to do what they were trying to do, they will end up in jail. That's no good, right? So they wouldn't change their character. They would just they would be intelligent enough to change their behavior to always pursue the same goal, which is their own self-preservation. But now they're just saying, look, the system, the best way to do it in the current system is to exploit everyone else. If you change the system, then I'll do something else. It's up to you, right? That's one way of reading kind of what's going on. Anyways, okay, we'll come back to a lot of that. But for Hobbes, there are not sins or no sins or bad actions or injustice in the state of nature. That is true. Yes, there are none. Why? Because sins or bad actions are ones that break laws, and in a state of nature, there are no laws. You have a right to everything or anything. Okay, that's the quiz. Let's. Why I want to read over the Wikipedia page about the Civil War. Some things about that. What kind of happened? Why did the Civil War come about in England, and why did civil wars start all over Europe and other places? Even the American Civil War happened for very similar reasons, which was in modernity, in the medieval period, you had this kind of all the wealth. Wealth and power are two different things that have to go together, right? Like they just you can't do stuff as a powerful person without wealth, because no matter what you're doing, you still got to pay for it. You might not think this is true. Like, couldn't the king just order people to do stuff? He could do that a little bit, but not really, because nevertheless, people have to survive, right? And they have to buy stuff from people. And so even if the king were to order his servants to build ships, they'd have to buy the materials from other countries and things, right? Because the people aren't self-sufficient. Even countries were not self-sufficient. So to be powerful, unless you're talking like in ancient Mesopotamia, where just to be powerful just mean you could beat up any other guy who was around, then you could be king. But in any kind of, from the Greeks onward, having any kind of power required a great deal of wealth to go with it. Now, as I said, generally power was thought to be based upon some kind of like divine authority. Even in ancient times, the kings were supposed to be like the gods, born in a different way and so on. And in Europe and in the Christian tradition, you have this idea that God created Adam as the first king, and all his descendants, the eldest sons, should be the kings, right? And this is where kingship comes from. It's called the divine right of kings. But a king without money is pretty darn useless because they can't do a whole lot. Now, for a long time, money and power just went together, but in the early modern period and then the Renaissance, before that, they start to come apart more and more, such that trade becomes very important. Production and manufacture of goods and the sale of those goods all over the world becomes important. And it suddenly becomes possible for bankers and merchants and producers of things, of rare things, to get lots of money, more money even than kings. Now, initially, those enterprises would be controlled by nobles because of their specific rights. So the first thing that starts to happen in the modern period is nobles start to become more powerful than the kings that are their rulers. So kings become these kind of like, they bring princes together and regions together, and they're supposed to rule the whole thing. But in reality, they kind of have to make each one of those princes happy and offer them things and stuff to retain their power over the whole, right? And so kings become less and less powerful, and they have, because they become more and more reliant for their wealth on the princes who have within their jurisdictions people that have money that can be taxed, who are merchants and so on. So money and economics just completely changes in Europe over this period. Slowly, you start to have the building of European banks, because as you may know, banks, I don't know, Islam, it has some things against banks, doesn't it? Aren't there some kind of rules against banking?
Yes,
think-
the interest
Yeah.
paid on deposits is not allowed. You can
Yeah.
only invest, you can only get money if you take risk, essentially.
So interest is a bad thing. It was called usury in the Christian church. People have started to lose that's one of the beliefs that has fallen by the side, I guess. Yeah. Lebanese banks still charge interest, don't they? Are there any banks that don't? Probably not. But
There's one only, but it's explicitly Islamic, like it's not commercial. So
I see. Does anyone put their money there?
I don't think many people put their money there.
So this was a long-standing problem in Europe and in the Middle East, the lack of banks, because banks are very useful. Loans are very useful. Not if you're a king, generally, not if you're a prince, but if you're someone who is one of these people who's like a merchant or something, you don't get your profits till after you sell your goods, right? So loans become very, very important. And also princes want to get loans themselves so they can open up, and try to create a money-making schemes. And so for this reason, the Jewish communities were very important in Europe, because Jews are not, there's no restriction within the Jewish religion about money and interest, right? This led to all the problems with, you can imagine one of the reasons the Jews were so disliked in Europe and so many myths about them were created was because almost every city would have a group, an area where Jews lived, and they were the only people who could do the banking. And everybody wanted them to do that banking because everybody profited from that banking. But then the Jews became very wealthy. And then the problem was, Christian, in the medieval period, particularly the Christian society was such that the laws did not apply to Jews in kingdoms. So they were outside of the normal law. What did this mean? This mean that if you were a Christian and you wanted to rob a Jew, go right at it, right? Because the Jewish families had no way of getting back or suing you in a court of law for stealing. So you get this really odd situation where the European communities want there to be Jews around so they can bank with them. The Jews end up, for this reason, gaining lots of money, and then they have no protections and can be exploited and robbed and mistreated. And so this is a lot of what was behind things that happened in Europe. This is why people always associate Jews with money and these kinds of things. There's a historical reason for it. And it's because their religion does not proscribe interest, which was actually in the interest of everyone, including the Christians, wanted to make use of this fact so they could have banks and invest their money and get returns and so on and so forth. So this is also why places like Venice became very, very wealthy, because Venice, although it wasn't Jewish, it separated itself off as an Eastern kind of style society within Italy that also didn't have rules against charging interest. And so they did all this banking and trading and so on in Venice. And this is how, for instance, the Medici family became so famous, because they were one of the earliest families that was non-Jewish to become basically bankers, right? And to say, well, I don't really care anymore what the rules are. And this is the Renaissance, right? And so these things started happening. Now, in the English Civil War, this is what happens when, so the power of the princes, as they become more wealthy than the kings, their power starts to exceed that of kings, and kings have to deal with the demands of all these princes when they get together and say a parliament. And they have to put together a body where the princes get to, decide things, and the kings, of course, they always had the full authority to do whatever they wanted. So they become rather pissed off all the time when the princes demand things and say they've decided things. And so the king always had the right in England to say that the parliament cannot meet. So the king could not tell the nobles what to decide in the parliament. But the king, if the king didn't like what the parliament was doing, he could just abolish the parliament, which is what he did. And this led, of course, to civil war. And as in any civil war, some of the nobles who could get more wealth from being friends with the king, they sided with the king and they were royalists. And then there were others who were against the king, and it was chaos. And that's what happened. Of course, even that would eventually change, where, as the princes get and the nobles get more powerful than the king, then eventually merchants and common people even get more powerful than the princes sometimes. And then that's as democracy starts to grow, right, in Europe, because more power is demanded by the people. Why? Because they are better educated and they are more wealthy, and they can therefore, the nobles and king begins to depend on them and their wealth creating abilities. So they can't say no in a certain sense. Okay, let's look at the text a little bit here. So here is Hobbes. I seem to have lost all my people on video. It's very lonely now. So Thomas
I'm here.
Hobbes, I know you're there, but I can't see you. It's more comforting to me. Actually, if some of you keep your cameras on, it's a little bit more, I don't know, it's just my thing. I like to I don't like to talk to a screen. I like some faces. What?
My camera is on the entire time. Every
Oh,
time.
well, I couldn't, it wasn't showing on my screen for some reason. Anyways,
Yeah,
no big deal, but it is more pleasant.
it's okay.
I mean, I could draw a little picture on my screen of a smiley face. They say this. This apparently has a very strong psychological impact. You've heard this thing, like they say, like on signs, they say like stop or do not step on the grass. The people obey it more if there's a face on it than if there's not on the sign.
Yeah.
I came back for you.
You came back from it. Okay. Anyways, so here's Hobbes's face. I don't know if that makes you more comforted. So Hobbes was a famous guy. This goes back to Marwa's question, like, why is he so famous? And there's lots of reasons. We can say a lot of things about this, but one lesson here you get is, like, say something interesting. And even if it's just bat crazy, false, it's more likely people are going to be interested in it than if you say something that's obviously true, but is just boring, right? Like radical ideas, extreme ideas give people things to talk about and to think about, right? It's a challenge. This is one of the reasons Hobbes is still talked about, but Hobbes he didn't invent what he's going to talk about. He's not going to invent the way of thinking we're going to get here. It's been around forever, right? If any of you were in 201 and you read very closely Thucydides' Histories of the Peloponnesian War, the political theory in that is still taught today. If you go to Harvard and study political theory, particularly as a graduate student, you almost certainly have an entire course on Thucydides. Why? It's on a history book. Well, because Thucydides expressed in the earliest and sometimes the most interesting and beautiful ways this philosophy of what is sometimes called, real politics, right? This idea that basically what rules the world is self-interest and power. And that same thing you'll find in Thucydides. People say this is good, and the politicians who are giving speeches in Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars will say, good is what I do, right? They'll sound very much like Hobbes. Not surprisingly, the first book that Hobbes published was a translation of Thucydides' Histories of the Peloponnesian War, right? So these kinds of might is right. This idea, these kinds of ideas about politics are things that Hobbes absorbed from lots of sources. So he's famous also for that reason, because he's kind of the epitome of a modern political theorist who took this line of thought and expressed it as clearly and as radically as possible. Now, as you said, his purpose there wasn't to be real or anything, right? His purpose was to be common sense and to help establish peace. Those were his real goals. He didn't want to be a badass, philosopher, politician guy with crazy ideas about how bad people are. He wanted to write a book that, among some of the first books ever, that would have an impact on the way the government would be thought of and run and structured. Like before, that wasn't even possible, right? You say, why did Machiavelli not really write a theory of politics? Because it was pointless, right? I mean, he had a theory of how princes should act, but about governments, who's going to listen to it? Who cares, right? In the modern period, though, people are thinking about there might be a better way. There might be a science to how these things should work. That's what Hobbes is trying to build, a science of politics for the design of a new government, new form of government. Now, of course, it has all the limitations of his own mind and his own period and probably his own personality. Now, Hobbes was reviled even in his own time. People did not like him. They called him an atheist. A lot of you will probably hear that Hobbes is an atheist. He is not an atheist. He is a materialist, though. They even blamed some large earthquake that happened on Hobbes. They said it was because his book, God was so upset at the publication of his book, it caused an earthquake. Now, why is this? Hobbes, when you're reading the text, you're going to find out Hobbes talks quite a bit about God. He gives God quite a. This is very often, more than Descartes talked about God. Hobbes is going to talk about God. How can he be an atheist? How can he be this terrible guy? Well, it's very simple, but you have to understand this. People often end up characterized in a certain way, particularly when it has to do with religion, because everybody has an interest in pigeonholing them some way. And it just so happens that both sides, pro and against, like thinking of them in this way for some weird reason. So let me explain that. So Hobbes, first of all, the Christian tradition is very good at calling people atheists, right? If you believe in God, I mean, it's just the case. If you look historically, you and I would read authors and we would say, God, this person is just obsessed with God. And I almost guarantee you they'll be called the greatest atheist. Spinoza is a wonderful example of the modern period. One of my professors once said that Spinoza is drunk with God. He's intoxicated. He talks about nothing else because for Spinoza, there is nothing else to talk about because the only thing that exists is God. And we are all parts of God. We're like insignificant little modes in God's being. We're like God's hiccups, something like that, right? We're like these little appendages to God. And God is in everything and everything. And he was characterized all throughout the modern period as the most dangerous of atheists. Why? Because I said this has been a part of. I mean, I don't know if this is a part of Islam or not, but it's definitely probably because any kind of strict doctrinal religion that's going to be like this is like, okay, we agree. God is all powerful. God is all knowing. God is all good. But I think God is red. And you think God is blue, so you don't believe in my God, so you're an atheist. Right? That's the logic of it, right? I believe God is three persons in one. You believe that he's two persons in one, which is the third person. You're an atheist, right? This is very often how things would go. Same thing with Hobbes. Hobbes is not an atheist in our sense. He didn't go around saying there's no God. That's what you and I think an atheist is. But for the Christians, Buddhists are atheists, Islam, the atheists, right? According to the medieval Christian tradition. Muhammad is an atheist, according to, like, what are you talking about, right? Because their idea is, you don't believe in my God, and my God is the only God there is. So you're an atheist, right? So Hobbes's views of God are really weird because he's a materialist. He believes the only thing that exists in the universe is matter, physical stuff, which obeys the laws of mechanics. And yet he believes God exists. And so what are we to do with that? Right? Either we have to say Hobbes is insane, or he has some very strange ideas, or he's hiding something, or something. It just doesn't make sense to us. But if he believes there's a God, he must believe that God is material in some way. That's clearly not an Orthodox Christian position, right? So most people who are Christians were very happy to call Hobbes an atheist. because he was weird. On the other side, after Hobbes's death, there are lots of people who are atheists, right? They think atheism is a good thing. They're humanists. They just don't believe in God. And they prefer people, and they like to have heroes in the intellectual tradition who they also thought were atheists. And so they like Hobbes, and they like to think of him as an atheist, right? So you get this weird thing where the religious like to call Hobbes an atheist because he's not religious enough. And the people who don't like religion want to characterize Hobbes as an atheist because he has, unfortunately, too much about God in his books, right? And so he ends up with no one who really wants Hobbes to be Hobbes. That's the way it is. But this happens, Hobbes is not unique in this. There are lots of, Kant is like this, Descartes has the same problem, you know, because he has, again, Descartes, right? He has this back and forth. He wants to be part of the church, and yet his ideas seem to go in other directions. And a lot of people who see Descartes as a hero just say, no, that's inconsistent, and they want to get rid of the religious aspects in Descartes. And then the other side, the people who are in the church prefer, I mean, Catholics today still regard someone like Descartes as, you know, part of the bad group, especially in North America. It's very strange. There's you know, in North America, there's even like this Catholic organization puts out a book telling students that go to college what they should study and what they shouldn't study. And like Descartes is one of those people you shouldn't study. This is very conservative Catholic right-wing stuff, right? Not the majority by any means, but you see it. It still exists. These kinds of ideas. So here is Hobbes. You know, I guess very, very boring looking guy. 1588 to 1679. Here is the frontispiece to his Leviathan. Now, Hobbes is very interesting in a couple of ways beyond what I've said. He's English, and yet he's not an empiricist. He's not like in fact, his method is deductive. He uses a deductive method. He's trying to, so something like a geometry of political theory. He has first principles, and like Descartes, he wants to derive from those first principles conclusions, right? So methodologically, he's much closer to Descartes in that respect. He's a mechanist. He believes, and that goes together, right? Like Descartes was an engineer, a mechanist, and he saw the method of mechanical physics and science as the deductive method, not the inductive method. Hobbes does pretty much the same, and he tries to generalize that method of mechanics, of physics, to political theory, right? And to beyond political theory. So that makes him also quite interesting. On the other hand, he utterly has nothing else in common with Descartes, because he has this idea because he's this materialist, right? And so he believes all that exists in the world is material. And so in his following of the Baconian idea of revising language in view of what is true, he has to say things like the soul, when you talk about the soul as an immaterial thing, he says that's nonsense. Sorry. You're talking about nothing. But there is this thing called personality and mind that the soul often refers to. So I think we should keep the idea of a soul. So Hobbes will use the word soul, but by it, he will mean the physical mind, right? The brain and its mechanisms, which he understands as like a kind of calculator. Has inputs and outputs, and it processes the stuff that goes in. That's his view of the mind, right? You would say he should say, since he says everything in the universe is a machine, he should say that nothing is living and everything is dead. Hobbes says, no, I like the word life. It's useful. Not to mean some kind of weird non-physical property of certain objects, but like, it seems to me that plants are different from rocks and trees are different from rocks, and human beings are different from rocks. And I like the word life to describe those things, but I need to come up with a mechanical explanation of their difference. What would that mechanical explanation be? He gives one. Living things are things where the principle of motion is within them instead of outside of them. Rocks aren't living because to move, you got to push them from outside. Whereas we have springs and wheels within us that move us. We're like automatons. So being alive is like being an automaton, right? And he says, no, that is what I mean by life. That's what life means now. So you see, he's systematically redefining language in view of his what we call ontology, or his theory of what there is. Now, what he does, as he should deductively, and this is where we're going to end today, he of course has to start off with his most universal principles. He did this in a book on matter and motion. It's a book on physics. It's deductive. And it starts with, definitions of matter and motion and space and time, and derives things like, inertia and so on. It's on physical bodies. Then in his next book, he wrote, these are all in Latin, by the way, on a certain kind of physical body, namely the human physical body. That's his book on human nature. And what does it do? It's like you studied electronics, and now you write a book on computer design. He studied the laws of physics and matter, and now he writes a book about the human design. And this is where he comes up with these ideas of what the fundamental principles of human action happen to be. And what are those? Glory, competition, and deference, right? Those result from a mechanical understanding of the purpose and structure of the human body, of which the brain is a part. And the fundamental thing that the human being is built for is self-preservation. We're self-preservation machines. Third book, Leviathan. How best could those machines be fit into one larger machine? So if his first book is about, analogous to a book on electronics, the second book is like computer design, the third book would be a theory of networks, right? What's the best way to put all those things together so that they can each fulfill their individual function best in community? How can the human being, in other words, best preserve itself in community with others who are all out to preserve themselves, and where each, in a state of nature, the best way to preserve themselves is by destroying the other things that are trying to preserve themselves, right? What do? We need to create a network by which we somehow we can still pursue our interests, and perhaps better, while not destroying each other, right? If that's possible, that's what the intelligent designer of a government would do, right? And that would be the idea. And that is, in fact, what we'll see Hobbes doing. What he calls the laws of nature are the rules that would be followed by any intelligent person who, in the most intelligent way, was preserving their own preservation in community with others. And all those basic principles of network design will be what he calls the rules of nature, or the laws of nature. Yeah. So there you have it. I think that's a good place to stop. Do read the Hobbes reading through, and we'll start getting in the text. Look a little bit at the Leviathan. One thing to do for the beginning of next class, look at this Leviathan and see how, even in this picture, you might see what I'm talking about with what the government is related to the people, and this connection. Okay? I'll see you on Thursday, I guess. Any questions?
Thank you.
All right.
Professor,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you again about what's happening with me when I'm annotating on the reader. I don't know where they're saving, and I tried the save as one that you told me, and even when I open the PDF again, it just doesn't show what I most recently highlighted. And I don't know why that's happening. I can't find them.
So tell me exactly what you're doing. So you have it open in Adobe Acrobat.
Yeah. And I highlight and
How
I
do you
make
open
sure
it?
to save. I open it from Dropbox.
Okay, you open it from Dropbox.
And when it opens in the Adobe Acrobat, I just highlight and I make sure to save the file a couple of times to make sure like everything's right. And then I just, when I want to put it again in the Dropbox, I do that. And when I open it again from the Dropbox, it just doesn't show what I
What do you mean
most
you
lately
put it
highlighted.
back in the Dropbox?
Like when I want it to be submitted with the full highlight again, with the common file that you created.
What, but, what do you mean you put it in the Dropbox? You shouldn't have to put it in the Dropbox.
I drag and put it in the Dropbox so that it uploads into the
From
most
where?
from Dropbox.
No. Where are you
That's what
dragging
I'm
it from?
to the file you created, but like I open it online.
You're doing something weird and you're replacing your, I think what you're doing is you're saving your changes to your Dropbox version. And then you're replacing your Dropbox version with another version that is not the one you're saving to. Somehow. So you should be able to, do you have Dropbox? It's in your file manager, right? It's on your computer.
Yeah.
And you open up your file manager and you see the file, yes? You
Yeah.
click that, it opens in Adobe. When you
Yes.
save that, it saves directly to that file.
Oh, so I don't have to do anything again, like
No,
resubmit it?
no.
Hmm.
So if you drag a different file in over it, you're just getting rid of the file you just saved all your changes to.
Makes sense now.
Okay. That's weird. Okay. So yeah, it's that's where it's saving it. Try it, and I'll check.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, you can just try it. Just go in, make some changes, save it, then immediately open the Dropbox one, and the changes should be there. And if they're there, they're with
I'll
me too.
try.
Okay. Let me know if that works out.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye. You just staying around to listen?
Maybe.
All right. See you.